So I think what all three of us came to the realization with over time is that a lot of the claims that are made in current research papers are not justified. Tim and Brent and I were all struggling with this. Well, how do we know what we know from these papers, from research? And we went back and we started thinking about that process. And it, frankly, for me, made me realize, I don't really know what I know from my own research papers. I haven't thought about that as deeply as I should have.
So, gentlemen, welcome to the Origins series. I'm your host, Rich McAdock from Purdue University, and let me introduce my guests today. We have the three co-authors of the forthcoming paper called Learning from Testimony on Quantitative Research and Management, and those co-authors are Andrew King from Boston University, Brent Goldfarb from University of Maryland, and Tim Simcoe from Boston University. Okay, good. Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Tell us a little bit about this manuscript. Give us just like the 1-minute elevator pitch explanation of what this manuscript is.
Would you like to go first, Andy?
I'll go first.
Okay.
I think the 3-sentence pitch is: we don't face a replication crisis in our field. We face an old epistemological problem, and that's of learning from testimony. And we think that if you frame the problem this way and think about it this way, you can identify changes in reporting and interpretation that will help us speed the development of knowledge. And we think that understanding and mapping epistemic uncertainty, model uncertainty, should be a critical part of research and reporting.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay. So I'll let me just dig a little bit deeper into that before I move on to talking about the development of the paper. But so tell us a little bit about the prescriptions that the paper presents for dealing with the problems that it addresses.
I would say that there's at least a couple, right? So one point that the paper makes and arrives at by sort of digging into a philosophical literature on when we should trust different kinds of testimony, which just really means things other people say. So one set of prescriptions is those who are testifying should kind of understand the sorts of claims they're making. And in the paper, we characterize the kinds of claims that are often put forward in management research into claims that are just an explanation for something that's observed, claims about frequencies with which we expect things to happen in random samples. So the kinds of statistical claims you often see, and then claims about the likelihood of a theory being correct. And those different kinds of claims require different kinds of evidence, and we unpack that in the paper. And then there's a different part of the paper that promotes this idea of mapping, sort of providing readers with a little bit better guide from, kind of what would be the necessary conditions for them to sort of believe the claims that are made, and showing kind of additional sorts of robustness of results, or how results change when assumptions change.
Okay.
Can I add?
Please, of course.
Yeah, well,
Tim,
one way
do
to
we let Brent add or not? I mean, what are the rules here?
It's usually okay.
Yeah, it's usually okay. All right.
I'm in trouble here. I'm in so much trouble already. I guess one way to think about what we're saying when we talk about model uncertainty in the mapping is that when we see a model reported in the paper, there's an assumption that model only makes sense if it is the correct model, which is of course something we can never know. And so what the mapping does is like, well, we don't really know which model is right. Let's look at a whole bunch of plausible models all at once and see if our result obtains in all or a subset or under what conditions. And it's just much more systematic and expansive than what you might see in a robustness check, which relies on the imagination of an author and a couple of reviewers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you're calling for perhaps a more systematic approach to thinking through alternative explanations in some sense.
Yeah. And not trumpeting a particular model that happens to be the best model by some criteria, usually means fit with theory, as opposed to when we have really no way of knowing that that is the correct model to begin with. And that's such a critical assumption in understanding the statistics.
I would say, I'm going to try to channel Andy. He can tell me if I'm right, that alternative explanations is just one piece. That if you want to make a claim about the explanation or the likelihood that an explanation is correct, then you need to think about alternative explanations. If you just want to make, say, a frequentist statistical kind of claim, you might not need to, but there's other kinds of conditions that have to be met, like you have to have specified your model in advance.
I think what all three of us came to the realization with over time is that a lot of the claims that are made in current research papers are not justified. And so, and we, you can even go into publications and even the top journals in our field, and you can find people making claims about that they have proven something, or they've shown something, or it is a fact that. And very commonly do we switch from a sort of frequentist perspective to a Bayesian perspective. And there are times when we take explanations of observed data and we claim that those are inferences, and that there was a great deal of confusion about the way people made claims from data. And likewise, there was a great deal of confusion about how to make inferences from the claims that people were making from data. So you read someone's paper, and you've seen this. You've seen someone come into a presentation and say, Simcoe has shown that X is true. And Simcoe was not shown that at best. Sorry, I sent Tim, but he at best probably in his paper has shown that from in repeated samples, given this particular model, it would occur this frequency of the time. At the most, that's what he's done. And he may have done something less than that. And then we realized that you get this ongoing problem of, then people will say that McAdock has said, that Timko has said, that, blah, 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 blah. And you get this ongoing creation of statements that are now accepted to be true, but may not be based on very much. And of course, at the same time, we also recognize that there's this problem of, questionable research practices and things like that, which make you wonder, well, what can I really infer from what I'm reading? And so from a variety of different directions, and I know this might be one of your future questions, Tim and Brent and I were all struggling with this. Well, how do we know what we know from these papers, from research? And we went back and we started thinking about that process. And it, frankly, for me, made me realize, I don't really know what I know from my own research papers. I haven't thought about that as deeply as I should have. It made me change the way I think about the claims that I can make in research papers. It made me aware of what others should be claiming from my research papers. And that ambiguity problem that we observe between the reader and the writer then drove us to be thinking about the way we should do research in general. And I think that the big prescriptions are probably, well, threefold. Enormous amount of modesty. Ed Leamer says that the more we claim we know, the more we should have to walk around with a big O around our necks for overconfident. The other one is we should much more often, and Brent's gonna light Brent up, and he's gonna go off like a Roman candle here. We should more often say that this is our best explanation for the data that we have observed, because that's usually what we're doing. And when we're making inferences about frequency, we should be very clear about that. And when we make inferences about belief, we have shown that X causes Y. or X is related to Y, rather than, something about the frequency of something occurring in a sample and blah, blah, blah. Well, then we have to be very, very careful about that. And the realization that we had, I think, was that this process is not just something that the researcher does. The reader has to do it, the reader-hearer. And in order for the reader and hearer to be able to do it very well, we have to provide them with new tools and new information. And that's why we basically got around to this idea of what we called epistemic maps in the paper. Other people call it model uncertainty analysis, where you show the problems caused by all of the different choices and assumptions that the original researcher has made on the inferences that a reader could make.
It can be quite sobering to take, I mean, I've done this in one of the replication papers I've done, where you take the original published models and then you kind of superimpose them onto one of these epistemic maps where you see like a whole range of models, and you realize that you're just looking at this, you're looking at one M&M in your M&M bag, and who knows, maybe you got the lucky M&M, right? But we really want to see the whole kind of a much broader range. So, and it's humbling. It's humbling. It's like, gosh, I thought I knew something, and now I realize maybe I don't.
Well, Andy, your comment makes me think about, the paper starts with the issue that authors may overstate the inferential value of their analysis. And, I suspect it may actually be more of a problem that other people overstate the inferential value of the author's analysis than the author himself or herself, right? That the people who are trying to build a case for their research based on someone else's research maybe even have more of an incentive to overstate the inferential value of the research that they're building on than the original author does. Am I right or wrong?
I'm happy to respond to that. And Rich, you got to understand also that this research is ongoing. And so I'm already noting in Tim and Brent's responses that you're getting other things that we're working on now, rather than this original paper. But
fair enough. Okay, so let's.
But I'm happy to answer that question, because
go ahead. Why not?
Well, I think one of the things that we argue in the paper is there needs to be a change in the division of labor between the reader and the researcher. And the traditional division of labor for the researcher, and Tim might disagree with me on this, I'd be really interested to hear what he has to say. This is the way this whole paper got written, is the original one is the researcher sat down, made a whole bunch of sort of assumptions, maybe he had the best guess assumptions about this and this and this and this and this and this and this, ran one model or a few models, maybe one model and 10 robustness tests or something, and then decided that he or she could make a unique inference from the data about the data generation process of some form, and then wrote that up. And readers were supposed to say, oh, okay, yeah, if I trust you and I think you're competent and you're sincere, that's now fact. And I think what we're arguing is there are so many of these choices as you walk through a lot of empirical processes that there's almost like a range of outcomes you could have had. And those ranges are based on your values and your priors and so forth. And your reader's values may be different than your values. And so one of the things the reader is trying to figure out is, well, given my values and my priors, what should I believe? So what I'm saying is, I think it's both. I think traditionally researchers have thought that they were supposed to come up with one thing from a result, and then they believed it. And I think readers were tended to do that too. And I think that both those were problems. Tim, you're probably going to tell me I'm wrong.
I don't know. My first inclination is that the sort of blame framing here isn't that productive. I mean, like, whose fault is it? I think the modesty, we definitely push that if all you can report is a plausible explanation for something, then it ought to be sufficient to stop there. And I do think that authors tend to push it beyond that frequently. I think that there's a common walking up to or going past this line where you sort of infer that so if you write down a theory or you have a set of sufficient conditions to generate some pattern in the data, you see that pattern and then you infer that that must actually be the right, what's going on. That's on the author side. And Rich, as you say, readers sometimes take that and run with it too for their own reasons. I don't know who's worse. But I mostly agree with you, Andy, that there's a lot of space for the current division of labor as between the author and the reader to change. And I think one of the things that we're hoping comes out of the mapping exercise, and I think we should be really clear on mapping that that's work in progress, right? In line with this sort of prescribing modesty, it has issues that we haven't completely sorted out as to how it's going to work. But part of that is to say, here, reader, this is, a map that takes you from, what you think would be the right sets of assumptions to make. And then this is what the output would look like under those assumptions. So you tell me ex ante what's plausible, as opposed to me adopting one set of assumptions and then digging in on those and sort of pushing them as the only plausible ones.
I interrupted. I'm sorry. There's a real tension, because we really want a story, and a good story, and hopefully a simple story. And it's just really an attractive thing just by nature of being human.
Mhm.
And the data often don't provide such a clean story, and we hide that.
Mhm.
And so part of that is hidden by the author. And then the reader doesn't particularly want an ambiguous story either, because that's hard to think about.
Mhm.
And it's our responsibility as scholars, from where we sit in this privileged position, to point out that most of the time, really know, we might have a good guess, but we should present it as a guess and leave lots of room for people coming after us, and even people just reading it, to say, you know what, that's not my guess. I think it's a different guess. And it just will leave a lot more room for constructive conversations around our research.
Okay, good. That's a great message. So who needs to hear this message? I mean, who is the target audience for this paper, or audiences? Who should be reading this paper?
Everybody.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the three of us probably all think, people who consume and who produce quantitative research and management should think carefully about these ideas. For me, the route into the paper partly came from, for years I've taught a PhD methods class and have been trying to develop a set of ideas that I call empirical etiquette. And I have a little web page about empirical etiquette, which is about, a set of messages about maybe how to write a paper so that it's friendly to the readers. But it was all a bit, kind of sui generis. Like it just came from, my own thoughts about what was, what would be nice. And Andy and Brent came from like some of their prior research, but collectively we sort of combined those ideas. And I think it was mostly Andy who put a philosophical underpinning in place for all of them.
Okay. And so how did you guys get the idea for this project in the first place? Where did the idea come from?
Okay, so this is our chance to give us a joke, in a sense, because
Okay.
we're about to testify now about the origins of a paper on testimony.
Of course.
And in order for you to believe us and take this information and share it, you have to believe we're competent to tell you what the story was, and we're sincere in doing so. Those are the verticality conditions.
What I should do then is ask each of the three of you separately in separate Zoom calls, and check the rate of reliability, do a Cronbach alpha and all that.
You're mapping. You're basically saying one of them is going to give you one answer, another one, and I'm going to look back and say, like, which one do I trust more? And maybe that one got it exactly. And we talked a little bit beforehand, And I think it's not clear to me we're competent to answer this question, because as we were going through, we would say things like, yeah, but then we did this. Oh, that's right. We did that too. So that took, there was a lot of remembering stuff that had happened.
Probably remembering some stuff that didn't happen.
Probably too. So I think
Mostly that, I think, Rich.
I think the short answer is Brent and I have been working on this problem of mistaken inference.
Mm-hmm.
Tim had been working on this issue of etiquette. I was then trying to work on this issue of thinking critically. We began to, and about the data, the evidence that you got, we began working together, and the paper morphed over time. And some of that was Joel Baum pushing us. So it started narrower and got better and more inclusive. You think that's fair, guys?
Yeah, I think that Andy is understating a little bit what he did. He's first author for a reason, and so Andy did something quite wonderful, which is
Yeah, you're going to cut this
we
out,
we
Richard,
had
right?
this we had this problem where Andy and I had been thinking about replication, Tim etiquette, and like, are results true or not? And should we believe them? And at a certain point, we realized that a lot of the claims in the literature are not really well justified. And the second thing we realized is this replication isn't going to be a panacea for us in terms of the nature of research we do together. And then we're like, okay, so maybe, Tim, we brought Tim in to like try to figure out how do we move forward? And then this is where the neat stuff happens is Andy went out and said, well, maybe we don't have the answers here. Maybe some of the philosophers of science have been thinking about this problem. And he brought in some really interesting work happening now in the philosophy of testimony, and kind of dug in there. He spent a summer doing this. And then he used us as kind of sounding boards to figure out how to bring it into management. And it's just neat, and it's super fun to think about. Some of this philosophy of testimony stuff goes back to David Hume. Like, he wanted to know if you should believe, he was trying to get at the doctrine of the church. And he was like, well, how do we know the miracles happen? People told us about it. Why should we believe them? And what are the conditions under which we should believe if things that people say are true? And it's the same problem actually here. And so that it was just a really wonderful thing that Andy has done as a service to the field.
Now, calling it the philosophy of testimony makes it sound highfalutin, but to be clear, here's how far the field has advanced. Believe it all, don't believe any of it, trust but verify.
Yeah.
And the thing is that's amazing about that is there doesn't seem to be a good answer. That's what I find absolutely stunning about it, in the sense that you can't, the people who are reductionists, the trust but verify people, point out we can't reduce everything that we hear because it's just too hard. So most of the time we just have to trust, which actually gets to an interesting implication for our field, right? Because most of the time PhD students just read stuff and say, oh, Goldfarb has shown.
Right, but so science is supposed to be an area of inquiry where trust but verify is sort of more possible than most domains of testimony, right? Like, and that's where there's room for prescription. Like, we can do a better job of making the verification possible. Maybe not perfect, but that's what etiquette ended up being about for me, right? Like, that's why that's the point of connection is, and then we both as readers can then be a little less credulous as well.
Yeah, that's nice. I remember in my high school there was exactly one philosophy course offered. It was called Theory of Knowledge, and I took this course, And I walked away thinking, yeah, epistemology is simultaneously the most important thing, but also the deepest rabbit hole. You know, it's in some sense, you know, absolutely essential, but also absolutely impossible. And you know, how do you manage that? How do you manage to make a contribution to understanding what knowledge is, in light of the fact, and you know, I think everyone would agree it's important. You know, you got to know. Well, I don't know. Maybe you don't have to know, but you'd like to know that you know how you know. But in some sense, how do we ever know what we know? So how do you make a contribution to that discussion that's meaningful?
Do you want an honest answer? This may
Sure,
get us
go
rejected
ahead.
in this journal. It's not.
You guys are going down this rabbit hole. I just want to
Yeah.
know what's happening.
We're deep, Rich. We're quite deep.
I
right now.
don't think we make a fundamental contribution to the philosophy of science. Wait a minute, I don't think. We did not make a fundamental contribution to the philosophy of science. I think what we did was we merged together some varying streams of thought from management, from statistics, from the philosophy of science into a coherent understanding with a reasonable suggestion. And I think it's one that is now available to lots of people. So I'm with Tim. I think everybody should read this paper. And I also think it could make our lives not only better in terms of developing knowledge, but easier. And what I mean by that is, I don't know about you, Rich, but when I do a project and I'm running models and I know that there are all these choices, like I'm walking through this garden and there's like 600 different directions to go. I'm constantly feeling like, oh, am I going the right way? Oh, I'm not really sure. But the great thing about the ending of this whole line of reasoning, which is this notion of mapping epistemic uncertainty or model uncertainty, is that it gives you the freedom to say, well, here's my best guess. Like, this is the line I think you should watch. But here's like a whole mess of other ones you could walk. And, you know, you might decide those are better. And that it's like transformative from a research point of view, I think. And
Yeah, for me, I 1,000% agree with Andy that we're not contributing to knowledge about knowledge and the philosophical debates on that topic. I think a better way of characterizing it is there's some intellectual arbitrage, you know, sort of by looking across fields. And I would characterize the state of where, you know, kind of we are in the big empirical methodological ferment as there are a variety of people running around with their own hammers, like characterizing problems as nails, right? There's the endogeneity identification folks who I'm associated with, I guess. There are, you know, kind of replication mafia, and there are, you know, whatever. There are other people who have another tool. And I think when you go down the rabbit hole of the philosophy of science, or maybe it was Andy who went into the rabbit hole, he sort of emerged with this interesting thing from in there, which is the philosophy of testimony. And using that gave us collectively a way of combining, you know, thinking broadly about how all of those different solutions fit together to a different sort of recasting the problem as not a problem of replication, not a problem of endogeneity, a problem of testimony and belief. See how they all fit together. And it sort of pointed us, I think, productively towards mapping and model uncertainty as an underappreciated aspect of the kind of global problem.
Good point. So let me follow up on that. What was it about the philosophy of testimony that was interesting enough to make you want to devote time to developing this project?
we can tell you factoids. We're not really sure. Because, so this was the conversation from earlier. We went back and looked at the earliest version, which did have the philosophy of testimony in it. Then we remembered early on, I was also interested in writing a book called Questioning the Wisdom of Experts, which ended up in the ash heap because the possible publishers all thought it was awful. But in that process, I had gone and I'd looked at the top 20 articles published in a very, very, very distinguished management journal and looked at the kinds of claims they made, because I was interested in how should someone read these claims? Like, you know, if you're going to hear from an expert, what should you think? And Brent and I looked at them, and you know, and we realized, you know, these don't follow. These guys can't make these claims, right? And then we started thinking, well, when can you make claims? And you know, what claims are right, and how should people interpret them? And then we looked at secondary claims. That might have been actually for another thing we were doing on the most cited wrong paper in another distinguished journal. We went and looked at the claims and realized, well, people are claiming this is true, but anyway. So then I think that's what started it. Can I say one last thing?
Of course.
There's another twist here that Brent and Tim may want to elaborate on, which is we're not alone. So you have Lemur writing in 1985 about taking the con out of econometric, 83. You got him writing at 85 about model uncertainty and sensitivity analysis will help. You've got Heckman writing years later about sort of there's going to be a way, you know, that where you're going to kind of constrain yourself with theory. So there's only one path through the garden. And then just a few years later, Tim, you can give me the dates, where he basically says, screw it. We can't really do it this way. We're always looking at the data first and then making inferences afterwards. And so you've got all these people struggling with this issue, you know, and you have Angrist coming back later after Lemur and saying, you know, we fixed it. And Lemur writing in, what's the name of the article?
Oh, Tantalus on the Road to Asymptopia.
Yeah, so, you know, which I love Lemur. He always is so clever. And so you get all these people struggling with this, and you read them and you can kind of like, you get to some place and go, oh yeah. No, I see where they're going there. I don't know. That was a crappy answer.
Yeah, but the flip side of it is, with a little bit of modesty, there's a way to rethink what is called the replication crisis or the reliability crisis or the reproducibility crisis, et cetera. And this is an out. Right? And the solutions that have been offered, like we'll pre-register everything, everything will be an experiment, et cetera, they don't really work for us. I mean, there's a place for them, but it's not a particularly large place in strategy.
That's too pessimistic. Brent's always,
I'm with Brent on this.
And well, it's good. Well, hold on. But let me first express, and then you disagree.
Okay.
And if we're just a little bit more modest with what we claim, and say maybe we're not finding the truth, but usually what we're doing is, this is a pretty good explanation for what I'm seeing here. Right? Let's keep searching and looking as we move forward, and maybe give this one a slightly higher prior than we had before. That seems to me like a much better way forward than saying, oh, look, I got a p-value less than 0.04. I have found the truth, which is how we write now.
Yeah, and I'm supporting Brent. Then somebody else comes along and they got a p-value of 0.06 and they say they've disproven the first paper.
Yeah, but look, these, I guess, don't throw out that baby with the bathwater, right? Like, I think things like replications and pre-registration, they have a place and they're part of the testimony for a good reason. Okay, these are tools that help build a better map, you know, to adopt the language from the end of our paper. And yeah, maybe authors who have grabbed hold of those things, I would agree if your point is they have some incentives to sort of oversell their flavor of solution. We just shouldn't fall into the same trap if our whole prescription is to be modest about the testimony that we offer.
So you mentioned that that the editor on the paper helped transform it in some ways. Can you talk a little bit about that? What were how did, maybe not particular to the editor, because I'm sure there were certainly reviewers involved in that process as well, and certainly you made your own contributions. But how did the paper change between the first submission and the final article that was accepted for publication? How did maybe put a little bit differently, how did the review process influence the paper?
They
don't
were
know.
remarkably tolerant.
I can describe the changes. I'm
I
not
think you're
sure.
best positioned to do it, Andy. But I mean, like, I think the thing to talk about is that we went through this very large transition, like where we had a version that was all about abductive versus inductive inference initially, and it was the most reworking of any paper I've ever worked on in my life to get from there to importing the philosophy of testimony and using that to frame all of a similar set of ideas.
No, the philosophy of testimony, it is true. The philosophy, I think what happened is the philosophy of testimony was there. There's also, I don't know. And I think there was a bit of a spillover from Brent's paper, my paper with Brent. But we were only focusing on these two kinds of things, right? Where you'd have an explanation. I looked at a bunch of data and here's my best story. And here's a frequentist result. But then we realized when we read papers, there were all these cases where people would flip it around and say, I have shown that X is associated with Y or X causes Y. Either way, they're making a claim about the truth of the hypothesis. And we went, oh my God, now we got a new kind of claim. And then once we added that claim in, it's got more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And Tim and I had this complicated discussion about Heckman and the invertibility of matrices and so forth, which I didn't really understand very well. But I wrote down sort of my own English version of it, pulled that in. I think what Joel did was, Joel is just the best at pointing out the things that you should do. And he's very good at synthesizing the reviewer comments and giving you advice that you can follow. I've worked twice with Joel, and both times it's been very, very rewarding.
Well, that's good to hear. Good to hear. What would you say were the biggest challenges that you faced in doing this project from start to end?
I'll answer for them.
Okay.
The constant need for Andy to rewrite everything 5 or 10 times before it is finally good enough.
A little self-deprecating.
I think that's like the first co-author agreement we've had in a long time.
Okay.
But to be clear, that's what made the paper good. Like Andy's insistence that we get it exactly right.
Wow.
It like really, I think, improved the paper. And frankly, there were times when Tim and, well, me, I'm not going to speak for Tim, we were like, okay, this is fine, Andy. And Andy's like, no, it isn't. And it, I think that I personally am better for it.
Okay, I'll raise another tension.
Okay.
So, there's a I'm afraid I'm going to light up my co-authors here, but there's an issue that, there's a question of whether you follow the main causes of problems out there and resolve those and try to go in one direction, or you take a more
Where are you going? Let me try one.
Yeah, I'm doing the Brent thing, and the p values can't.
Yeah. I mean, so Brent and I we just put more emphasis. Each of us places greater weight on the problem associated with the tool that we're bringing. For me, that's causal inference and the toolkit from econometrics for dealing with issues, kind of the multiple causes kinds of problem and inferences about whether you can make a belief claim, like what are the necessary conditions for a belief claim. Brent's, I don't know if you want to characterize, I'll try it for you and you can tell me if I get it right. I would say is coming from a place after having done work on p-hacking and apophenia of being more concerned about the unreliability of frequency claims because people routinely look at the data, then report statistical tests that presume that they haven't looked at the data first, that as though they were pre-specified. And that those are two different, conceptually different problems. And he and I kept pulling towards the problem that we thought we had an answer to. And I think that, yeah, Andy was pulling us back towards a coherent framework that nested them both.
I think that's right. I think
That
that's
sounds
right.
like a good productive tension. Yeah.
It was really fun. And and Tim characterized it very well. And I distinctly remember being in an airport boarding area in a conversation with Tim about exactly this tension. And I think we kind of found a happy medium in the end. Like, I don't want to say everything's like, and I don't think Tim and I completely agree even today, but we're much closer than where we started. And that was like super productive and interesting.
I find that when the paper is accepted, I often feel very good about it in retrospect.
Well, you know, there was a reason why Siskel and Ebert were so successful, right? They had somewhat orthogonal views and tastes in movies. You know, one was more of a intellectual, the other had more plebeian tastes, and you knew that if a movie got 2 thumbs up, that it really was a good movie because it appealed to both sides of that tension. And so I think the same is true often in co-authorship relationships where, you know, if you're both coming at it from exactly the same angle, you know, there's not that much that each one is adding, right? But if you're coming at it from different angles, you know, maybe not opposite directions, because then you don't get anywhere if you're just playing a tug of war with each other, right? But if you're coming at it orthogonally, you can maybe improve the product by challenging each other. And I think that sounds like what it was. It sounds like you guys had a lot of fun with this project. Is that right? Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah, mostly. Yeah.
Was it fun, Andy?
It was super fun. Yes. Unequivocally.
I had a great
Can I make one last plea for the paper?
Oh, of course.
I think the thing about the paper, by telling people that the reader is important in the formation of their own inferences from the data that are presented, that's liberating. Because rather than a researcher deciding that they have to pick and do the one right thing and then tell that to the reader, they now can think, okay, well, I have to give the reader the necessary tools to make a decision. And when you frame it that way, I have found, and been doing some follow-on things on, Brent, you can speak to this too, a lot of the anxiety, a lot of the tension, a lot of the frustration that we experience in our own research, guilt, goes away. And I really want to get PhD students doing this. I think it'll be eye-opening and mind expanding. And I really think it can improve the way that the rate at which we build knowledge. And just one last thing on, you know, Brent had this paper. Part of this history is this paper. We're not sure if it was a paper or a presentation because we can't find the paper, but was replication will not save us. And one of the things is if we are going to understand a field by sequentially walking through it, each researcher one after another, we'll never map the full space. And what we're trying to get you to do is think, no, you want to present to the reader a topography. You want to present to the reader a full map. And that's liberating. I find it extremely liberating.
We can't find it because I threw that in the trash, Andy. That's the reason. Like I can tell you where it went, but
it was it's a good idea. We should write that paper.
So, you know, obviously the paper is written to empiricists to make recommendations to empiricists. So it's clear that you hope that the paper will have an influence on future empirical research. But let me ask if there are other possible influences that this paper might have in the future beyond just the future empirical research that empiricists reading it might do. What about do you think this paper could have influence on future theory work, on future practice, or future policy?
Can I go radical?
Yeah,
Go
you
for
go
it.
radical.
Okay. So one of the implications of what we're saying, in which you have to roll back your claims a little bit to more of an explanation, is that most empirical papers you see, yes, they deal with an empirical pattern, but they're somewhere on the spectrum between a theory paper and creating replicable facts that we know about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you see the world that way, you recognize that what we're saying is that this dichotomy that we have right now in the literature isn't quite real.
Mm-hmm.
And it's blurred. And so you could think of, say, AMJ, I know we're at AMR right now, but you can think of AMJ as a theory journal, unless those papers have, unless the empirical claims are really at a level or have conditions that are almost impossible to satisfy for the questions that are interesting to AMJ readers.
Mhm.
And so it's not like a shortcoming of the empirical work in some sort of, they're not doing sophisticated enough econometrics. It's that they're addressing questions that are fundamentally challenging to do in the way that would allow really, really strong claims. And we should recognize that and see these as explanations and think of it as a lot of theory building as well.
Mm-hmm. So the same prescriptions that you're making about empirical work would apply in maybe a slightly different way for theory.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, let's say Kathy Eisenhardt's work, she's pretty explicit, like, this is grounded theory building. We're building theory from cases, and these are propositions. Well, at some point, just think about it. So she has 5 observations. And at what point does it become something else? At 40, at 50? You could just see it's a messy boundary. And then it's even worse, because if you have super large data sets, like, you can still have this problem, but sometimes they're easier to resolve with large data. It gives you a few more options.
Okay.
I think, look, people who do formal theory already understand at a somewhat intuitive level some of our prescriptions, right? Like, there's a push for generality in model building, which is precisely analogous to mapping the full space of plausible assumptions in empirical work. But I would say that the audience, you framed the question as that the audience for our paper, it clearly includes people who produce empirical work. But I think at the outset, we said it's for people who produce or consume. Theorists who consume empirical research should be liberated, in part because I think that it frees them up to make, they don't have to hew too closely to empirical research that's meant to produce facts, which are a little bit more open to question than we tend to let on.
And how about practitioners or policymakers? Is there something in this paper for them too?
Andy's book.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so practitioners and policymakers, I've written this very short little thing about this, kind of a highlight of a few of these ideas about being better able to understand when someone is giving you an explanation, when they're giving you a frequentist result, when they're making a belief claim, what's the basis of the argument that they're that they're, how are they forming their argument? Can you assess, are they competent? Can you assess that they're sincere? These kinds of things. I think a thing that really concerns me, Rich, is the following. You will get, and I'm in the area of social and environmental performance and social and environmental performance and financial performance, right? And you will get a result and people will like that result. It'll be a single result with a zillion different assumptions in it. And it'll go
policy prescription, their favorite policy prescription.
And it'll go out and it'll just spread like wildfire. And people will think, oh, that's true. And they'll run off in that direction for a while. And I would say that one of the problems with the, you know, the business and environment movement for the past 25 years is we've run off sequentially in directions with great enthusiasm based on a single result. And then 5 or 6 years later, we'd realize, yeah, actually, it's not as reliable as we'd hoped, and turn around and head back in the other direction. So I'm hoping that people recognize what a single result means, particularly the way we report it now, and expect this kind of massive understanding of the epistemic uncertainty. That is the how do we think about the world uncertainty to be delivered along with the statistical uncertainty so that they can make more informed choices.
Sounds good. Good advice. I hope that message gets out there.
Knock on wood.
Working on it, working slowly though, because I have to write a lot of drafts.
And perhaps this video will contribute to getting that message out.
Hopefully.
Good. Well, are there any questions that I didn't ask that I should have asked?
I have a question for you, Tim.
Ah, that's interesting.
Did we do anything really? Did we do anything really relative to what top scholars already knew? Now, maybe that's too hard of a task. Yeah. But did we do anything? I mean, Lemur.
So you're asking, would Ed Lemur, reading this article, would he learn something?
What do you say? Yeah.
You know, so there's this set of people who we kind of reify in the paper, right? Andrew Gelman in stats, and Ed Lemur and Jim Heckman in econometrics. Then some philosophers too, right? Like Spanos and Deborah Mayo. I don't think that any of the points that we make about the limitations of the tools we've got to sort of advance knowledge frontiers would be genuinely startling to any of those folks. I do think that the framing of it in the epistemology of testimony is entirely novel, and that the typology we offer of claim types hasn't been clearly articulated.
Yeah.
And that they would find that helpful.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, there is that one paper by Elizabeth Fricker where she sort of gestures at this and sort of says, well, yeah, there's probably we don't have to worry about it in the sciences. That's kind of what she says.
Actually, there's one other thing here, which I think is interesting, really subtle, but interesting, and might be kind of perceived as an incremental advance by those folks. I don't even know if we all agree on this idea, but I think it's right. And this is at the heart of the disagreement between Brent and I, if it's still a disagreement. It's that, Brent was taking a really firm, principled stance on you cannot report a frequentist test statistic. It has lost its meaning if you looked at the data prior to doing the analysis, because it's just sort of fundamentally polluted, right? Like you've peaked, and peaking undermines your ability because somehow you've been influenced, which I think it's hard to refute, right? Like, so that's an assumption almost. Like, let's take that as given for a moment. I think the idea behind mapping is that's not necessarily true for a reader, and a reader might be able to sort of specify what assumptions they would like to make. And then you have kind of solved a fundamental problem of reporting by allowing the reader to choose the assumptions and then look up what the results would be. And that it's kind of a path around the problem of reporting frequency statistics or making frequentist claims that has merit from, I think, a philosophical perspective. I don't know if it's an exact solution, but I think that idea, I think that idea might be novel.
Yeah,
Brent, I'm curious how you think about that.
I just think it's really, really hard to do that because you have to structure the reporting in a way that maintains the reader's ignorance for quite a while. And the way we report our results now is we give them a reason to read, which is usually, I'm going to show you why whatever. And so one might be able to do what you're describing, but it's going to require a lot more in terms of how we structure our reporting. And in so doing, you're going to lose readers because they want the story right away and time is short. It's a real tension.
Anyway, so these are some of the things we're struggling with these days.
Yeah.
It's a real pleasure. I have no idea how you're going to edit this into coherence. If you can manage to do that, you're a good man.
I will leave it to the reader to edit.
Oh, God, sure. And you know how they'll edit? They'll turn it off after about a minute.
Exactly, right to the circular file.
Yeah. All right.
Gentlemen, it's been a blast. Thank you very much for participating in this ritual.